So whenever you want to start, just go right ahead.
Okay. If anyone, if this goes or whatever, I have a problem with the cell phone or you can't hear or see, please let me know right away, okay? And maybe every now and then you could just say, I hear you, I see you, or whatever, so I know I'm not talking to like the cloud. Okay, I'd like to first thank Kiki for arranging all this. I spoke with her several times on the phone in the last few months, and we were going to do something in person, but that was before the coronavirus hit. So we're going to do it online, see how it goes. Let's see. She also mentioned just a little while ago, I should start with mentioning there's 2 nights of this. The first night tonight, I'm going to cover Israel Putnam's early life and what he did throughout the French and Indian War, and then cover the time period between the 2 wars right up until the beginning of the American Revolution. And then next time, a month away, I'll be covering his role in the American Revolution as a major general, and then what happened to him after the revolution for the rest of his life. So his life fits well into this format because the 2 major events that he experienced were the 2 wars, which were the 2 most important wars, obviously, of the 18th century in North America. Speaking of those wars, sometimes I consider his role in the French and Indian War something like a Davy Crockett. And if you read the tales of his life, they fit in right with what Davy Crockett did a half a century later, or even more than a half a century. But his role during the Revolution, which we'll see next month, is more like a George Patton, where he was that kind of general. The only difference is if you remember the story of George Patton slapping a couple soldiers who had post-traumatic stress syndrome, even though they didn't know that term then, he knew what, the generals knew what it was pretty much. Putnam would not have done that. One of the things I found out after my research on Putnam's life, he was well known for his compassion for everybody, not only his soldiers, but also the civilians and even the enemy. And I'll be touching something on that tonight and then also during the Revolution talk. Okay, are there any questions before I start?
Nope.
Okay, good. That's what I like to hear. I like this. I like to know someone's there. Okay. In the American Revolution, there were about 75 generals in the Continental Army over the period of the 7 years of the Revolution. Matter of fact, until the Vietnam War, there had never been a longer war than the Revolution for this country. But of those 75 generals, how many of them are known today? Okay, I'm going to ask everyone here. Okay, obviously everyone knows Washington, and now you know Putnam, but do you know the names of any of the other generals in the Revolution, American generals?
Generals?
Green.
Green, okay, Nathaniel Green. And next time I'll be talking about that because he was related to the Revolutionary time.
Knox.
Knox, very good. Henry Knox.
That was my wife. Who?
Well, Lee, Fort Lee.
Right.
Yes, Fort Lee, and there was up the Hudson River, and that was after General Charles Lee. And then probably someone who's even more famous.
Wayne.
Yeah, Mad Anthony Wayne. He was on my list here. Benedict Arnold, right? Benedict Arnold was a hero up until the time he turned traitor. And then we mentioned before Alexander Hamilton.
Good job.
And of the 75, we probably mentioned 10.
Well,
which is not unusual. Matter of fact, that's probably pretty good, and it's because a lot of folks here know something about American history. But of those generals, if after the American Revolution, someone had said, who was the greatest fighting general? Who is the toughest general? Most people would probably say George Washington. But if you asked them at that time, that same question, who's number two, a lot of people would have said Israel Putnam. That's how famous he was at the end of the revolution. Matter of fact, he was famous before the revolution because of his role in the French and Indian War. Even though he was only a captain and a major, that's the highest he achieved, and he was only in the militia, okay, not the regular British Army in the French and Indian War. He still was famous. He was like a Daniel Boone or a Davy Crockett between the wars. That's why when the revolution came around, Congress did not hesitate when his name was proposed to be one of the first major generals, because almost everyone in the colonies knew who he was, even though he came from a small place in eastern Connecticut. Speaking of the locations, Putnam's life involved primarily 3 states, okay? Other places too he fought in, but 3 states. One, he grew up in Massachusetts and lived there for 20 years. 2, his home, his permanent home for the rest of his life was in northeastern Connecticut, which is very sparsely populated even today. And 3rd, New York State. Everywhere from Long Island all the way up to the Canadian border, he was by far the majority of his work as a soldier. Okay, his fighting took place in New York. There were other places too, but I would guess that 85% of his life that he actually fought as a soldier, as an officer, took place in the state of New York. So it's very important to anyone like you who live in New York, because it's really, his history is your history. One other point about, to start it off, every generation from 1788 up through the beginning of the 20th century saw 1 or 2 new biographies of Putnam every 25 years. After 1904, there were only a couple full-size biographies, and even those weren't really footnoted. They were mostly made for the general population, and they appealed to children as well as adults. So not much has been written, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, because there is no such thing as a full modern biography.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So I went to Greenwich Library when we were first thinking about doing this, and they have a huge stock of Israel Putnam stuff. But after about the 1930s, all I could find was children's books, basically. And there were those early, they're weird hagiographic stuff. They're not even remotely historical. But so why did that happen? Even in Greenwich, where he's on their seal, how did he become so unknown?
My theory is that as the years went by, as the decades and the centuries went by, the country had new heroes. And as they have new heroes, you can't have 300 well-known heroes that everyone knows details about. So some fell to the wayside. Unfortunately, one of them was Israel Putnam. So he fell to the wayside just before World War I. But he was still, like you say, a subject matter for children's books. But the only books I know of, there was one, I think it was called Old Put in the 50s, which was a very readable and an interesting book. But again, it wasn't really fully documented. And then there was a very small book done on the bicentennial year of 1976. And it was one of these series where they give one, like Putnam to one author, writer, and they give Hamilton to another. And so they have a whole series for the bicentennial. So it really wasn't a complete biography. But I used both of them in my research, because one way or another, everything's important. But the most important biographies in my opinion, and which I used, was one, David Humphrey's 1788 biography of Israel Putnam and Livingston's 1901 biography. Okay, reason for Livingston is because his was so substantial. The footnotes, the references, the bibliography, his research was really tremendous. The reason for David Humphreys is because Humphreys knew Putnam because he was one of his aides, his military aides during the war, during the Revolution. And when he researched it, he asked two people up in Putnam's hometown, because Putnam was still alive then, to interview Putnam for his book. And they did that. One of them was a former Army surgeon, and he went to Waldo. He went and saw Putnam at his home and interviewed him, and then forwarded that to the information down to Humphreys, who was living for about a year at George Washington's Mount Vernon. He was a house guest of Washington for about a year. So I suppose that Washington had a hand in this too, at least in reviewing the book and editing it for Humphreys. So that's why that's my gold standard. Okay, Humphrey's 1788 book. It's a very small book. You can get it anywhere. You can see it on the internet for free. All right, but it's really, I started with that. And every time I wrote a new section of the book, I would consult with Humphrey first and see what he said. Because those were, some of the things were obviously right out of Putnam's mouth. And that was published 2 years before Putnam died. So those are two books that are very good. Matter of fact, I did a website. Okay, I wrote this book. It was published 3 years ago. One of the reasons the publisher agreed to publish my book was because it's not self-published. I didn't have to pay for this book, but they had to approve it. They had to adopt it. And the reason they did is because back in the 90s, I created the Israel Putnam website. And as far as I know, I'm the only person around who has an Israel Putnam website. And I used excerpts from Livingston's book to fill up my website back then. And then I also toured all these locations like West Point and Bunker Hill and these things related to Putnam back in the 90s without any idea I was going to write a book 20 years later. But when I did write the book, I dug out all those pictures and all my notes and everything and called people I met, and it really served to help me a lot to have the background. But anyway, let's dig into Putnam here. His birth. He was born at a place called Danvers, Massachusetts in 1718. January 7th, 1718 under the new calendar. And has anyone ever heard of Danvers?
Yes.
It had another name back then. You know what that was?
No, I
Salem
don't.
Village. Salem Village. Does that ring a bell, Salem? Salem, Mass.
I have
Putnam,
relatives in Massachusetts on my husband's side of the family. So I'm not familiar with an older name for Danvers.
Okay. Today it's called Danvers. Back then it was Salem Village, and it was the site of the Salem witch trials. Now, they took place 26 years before Israel was born. However, one of his first cousins was one of the accusers. She accused people of being witches. And her father was one of the judges. So it was a pretty nasty blot on the Putnam family name. However, Israel Putnam's parents were just the opposite. They opposed the trials. They opposed the hysteria. As a matter of fact, one story goes that Putnam's father kept, during the height of the witchcraft hysteria, he kept a horse saddled all night long and a loaded musket by the door in case he and his wife would have to escape. Not that they would be accused of being witches, but they would be hated because they opposed the tyrants in town. So that's the kind of family that Israel Putnam grew up in. However, he was the 11th of 12 children. So he was born long after that, and his father died when he was young. So he was like the little kid on the block. But when he grew up, he grew up in a farming family, okay, well-to-do. They weren't what our equivalent of millionaires, but they were well-to-do farmers. worked hard, and they had a lot of acreage up in Salem, which is Danvers. Okay. And then Putnam came into his inheritance when he was about 21. And at that time, he married a woman, Hannah Pope, and they had one son. And at that time, Putnam took his inheritance and he bought half of 500 acres in Connecticut in a very poor soiled area, and moved down here, built a small house. I don't know how large it was, but it's no longer around, probably 2 rooms. And they lived down here and farmed. And he had a little orchard, but mostly he raised sheep and goats. And that was for many years. And that's all he was. All he was is a farmer for all those years until the French Indian War. And when that broke out, he was in his 30s, like 36 years old. Now, I got to go back. Only one event occurred in Israel's life in those farming years, and that is when he was 25 years old, he became famous locally for killing a wolf. Now, nowadays, you would think, well, wait a minute, if there's a wolf, you don't want to kill it, you want to take it, report it, and they'll transport it up to Maine or Canada into a place where there aren't a lot of people like living. However, back then, you didn't really have an alternative, especially since one night, the wolf came to Putnam's farm and killed 70 of his sheep, 70.
Wow.
And it was known as, the wolf was known to come back every winter and just kill animals for the fun of it, not just for food. So the farmers wanted to track down this wolf. And one night, they tracked it all the way to the Connecticut River, which is about 30 miles away in the snow, so they could see the tracks. And then they followed it as it turned around and went all the way back to its home in Pomfret, Connecticut, Putnam's home. And the wolf went into a den. They call it a den. It's like a bunch of glacial rocks and there's a long tunnel underneath the rocks. And they found it went in there and they tried to get it to come out. Now I have a picture here somewhere. This is the den today. If you're ever up in Pomfret, Connecticut, there's a state park, and this is the opening right here. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. And this is a little plaque describing the story of Putnam and the wolf. Sounds like a children's story, but this is a true story. And the wolf went in here, and the tunnel went in, and then went sideways, then went up, and it was a total of 41 feet deep. Now, I crawled in it a number of years ago, and you could only go in about 14 feet because the state of Connecticut filled it in so people couldn't go in there. Probably because it's a wonderful home for animals, and they didn't want people to be surprised. But you can go up there and see this, and it's in the middle of like many, many acres of forest. But it's not hard to get to because they just made a little parking lot for cars that were going to visit it. And here's a little picture of that place. I gave this talk about 2 years ago for the local library up there. And this is me. Where am I? By the way, this is kind of greenish because my printer ran out of ink. But here I am giving the talk, and here's the people attending. And right behind this guy over here, right behind this guy over here is the opening to the tunnel, which they call the wolf den. Okay. So what happened that day is they had the wolf cornered in Pomfret in the wolf den, and the farmers tried to use smoke to smoke it out. Wouldn't work. Then they tried burning sulfur, and the wolf still wouldn't come out. Then they sent their dogs in, and the dogs came out all bruised and bloody. And they couldn't do anything. So then they said, well, get Israel. Israel's got the best dog in the area. Now, at this time, Israel's 25 years old. He's just starting as a farmer. But he brought his dog down, and the dog would not go in. Apparently, he had the smartest dog in the area. And so then Israel said, look, I'll go in. And he says, give me a torch. So he lit a torch, loaded his musket, and crawled in the hole. But before he did, he tied a rope around his ankles. And he said, pull me out if I jerk the rope. He went all the way in, and the wolf made such noises and almost was ready to pounce on him. It was all the way at the end of the tunnel. And the farmers immediately pulled him out. And they pulled him out so fast that Israel was the one who was all bruised and bloody. And his shirt came off over his head. Then he crawled back in again with a new torch. And he went right up to the wolf and he shot it, just as it was about to jump on him. They pulled him out again this time. It was all covered with smoke. They pulled him out again. Then he went in the third time and to check and see if the wolf was dead. He grabbed the hold of its ears and they pulled both of them out. And this was such an event for these farmers because they had lost animals too. It was such an event. They put Putnam on their shoulders and carried him through the 3 miles through the woods to have a midnight party to celebrate. Now, this event, which was local, spread throughout Connecticut and beyond. And Putnam became famous as the man who killed the wolf. As a matter of fact, it lasted so long that throughout Putnam's life, his nickname was Wolf Putnam or Old Wolf Putnam, even though this is apparently the only time he ever saw a wolf or confronted one. And if you go to his town today, his hometown, and you see the monument that sits above his grave, a large equestrian statue, on either end of it is a large wolf head to remember that incident in Putnam's life. Now, as I say, that was the first 36 years of his life. Except for that, he was just a common farmer in New England. Okay, any questions?
Where was he buried?
He's buried in Brooklyn, Connecticut, which is just south of Pomfret, Connecticut. It's like the distance it would be like saying, Portchester versus Greenwich, Connecticut. How close are they? They're adjacent. Except Portchester and Greenwich are like massive metropolises compared to Pomfret and Brooklyn today. I doubt if there's hardly any more people up there now than there was 250 years ago. Okay, but it's obvious, you can't miss it because it's right in the center of Brooklyn, the statue. Then the French and Indian War came about, and he was one of the first people to volunteer to fight with the British against the French and their Indian allies. Now, the British also had Indian allies, but the location that they went, the French primarily were allied with the Native American tribes. And that was up by Lake George, north of Albany, Lake George, Lake Champlain, in that area. And Putnam was instrumental in helping the British troops as a scout. Now, has anyone ever heard of Rogers Rangers? Rogers Rangers was a group of scouts, of men who went around to determine what the enemy was doing, people who were really in the most dangerous parts of the forces. Their descendants, in a way, were like the Green Berets of Vietnam or the Army Rangers of today. That's the type of people they were. And Rogers formed a group of Rangers that became famous. As a matter of fact, there was a movie made on his life back in the 40s starring Spencer Tracer as Rogers. Unfortunately, there's never been a movie made on Israel Putnam. But anyway, he learned a lot under Rogers, and then he started his own group called the Putnam Rangers. And he went around as a scout himself, plus employed other people, and he was promoted to captain. So it was Captain Putnam and his Rangers. And there's many, many stories, and most of these come from the mouth of Putnam himself.
Professor, quick question, if I may?
Yes.
and I'm not sure where I read it. It may have been your book. It may be one of the others. But the comment at the time, especially from the men, was that where Rogers ordered, it was Putnam that led.
Right.
He was
exactly.
Soldier.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I had written down here in these notes that exact quotation. All right, I don't know where it is now. But yeah, because Putnam was hands-on. He was a hands-on guy. He didn't just sit in the back like a mile away from the front lines and let everyone else do the work and experience the danger. He actually led in person. And that was throughout the Revolution too, when he, like, especially at Bunker Hill. But back to the French and Indian War, there's a lot of stories, and I selected a couple here which might be of interest. One is something that happened a year after Putnam joined up. This is 1755. Putnam's about 37 years old. By this time, he was just promoted to captain, and they asked him, the commanding officer up there, this is north of, up by Lake George, the commanding officer asked him to scout out this enemy camp to see what they had there, how many troops, what supplies they had, what was the situation. So he went along with another man who reported to him, Lieutenant Durkee, and they went to the camp in the dead of night, and they crawled in, and they made a mistake. They didn't realize the British camps, most of the time, the troops were camped in the middle, and they had a whole string of fires going around the camp. But the French camp had usually fires in the middle, and then they camped around the fires. So it was the opposite. And so when they went in, Putnam and Durkee, they crawled in, and they thought they were at the edge of the camp, but they weren't. They were right in the middle. And all of a sudden, they noticed that different soldiers waking up behind them, and they had to get out of there fast. And they ran as fast as they could in the dark. Durkee got shot in the thigh, but Putnam got ahead of him, and they found a large hole that Putnam jumped into. And as soon as Putnam jumped in, one of the Native American warriors jumped in after him and raised his hatchet. And Putnam raised his and was just about ready to kill the man when the man started speaking English, because it was Durkee, not the warrior. And he almost killed him. As they waited for the troops to go by, the enemy troops, they finally went up onto a hill where they'd be in a better position, and they were able to sleep for the night. But before they did, Putnam said to Durkee, let's open my canteen, because I just loaded it with rum. He opened it up, and not a drop was in there because a bullet had gone through it. As they were running away, they had been shot at. And then in the morning, when they shook out their bedrolls, Putnam had 14 bullet holes in his bedroll, which was on his back when he was running. Now, that doesn't mean 14 bullets hit him, but then because one bullet can make a lot of holes at once through a rolled up blanket. But he was almost killed at that time. And that was just one incident. I just chose that one. And I could go on and mention many, many others. By the way, here's a picture of the powder horn that Putnam had in 1756. And this, by the way, is a picture taken from, can everyone see that?
Yes.
It's a picture taken from Livingston's 1901 book. And it mentions on the side, it was carved at Fort William Henry, which was on the south end of Lake George, New York. Okay, this other tale involves this tree right here. Okay, this picture obviously was taken in the 1900s, since the photography really wasn't invented until like 1827 or something. So, and you can see a little calf down here. So it's a pretty big tree. And I think it might be still alive when this was taken. Well, maybe not. This tree is believed to be the one that Putnam was tied to in 1758. He was 40 years old. He had been serving now for 4 years in the French and Indian War. He was captured by Native Americans. They were led by the French up in just south of Lake George, New York. And after they captured him, they first tried to take like tomahawks and throw him, tied him against a tree, throw him against his head, see how close they could come. Then one of the French soldiers came up, took his gun and shot Putnam in the chest point blank. And obviously the only reason he didn't die was because the gun misfired, as these muskets often did. And then the man took the butt of his gun and smashed Putnam's face so badly that his jaw was broken in several places and he really couldn't even move it. Then they took him, tied him to another tree, presumably this one, and set a fire underneath it. Putnam had enough slack in the rope to kind of get out of the way a little bit, but a little rainstorm came, put out the fire. Then they relit it. And this time, the Indian who had captured Putnam went to get the French officer in charge. He came over, kicked the fiery brush away, and released Putnam and put this Indian, in charge of Putnam as they took him as a prisoner of war to Canada. Now, there's loads of evidence for this story because there were so many people involved and it was documented. Today, this tree is no longer there, but I did give a talk up there at Crown Point, the fort at Crown Point. It's a state historic site now. I gave 2 talks like about a year and a half ago up there. And there was a person from the local historical society, and they said that come on over to our place next time you give a talk, because we'd like to show you a piece of that tree. So I did. We came up, I did a talk about 2 months later up there, and they have one framed in a shadow box on the wall of the Historical Society, a piece of the bark from the tree. Also, that woman told me that her father had told her that when he was young, back in the 1920s, he saw the stump of this tree. It was still there, but now it's totally gone. But the place, I went to the place where this tree had stood, and there's a monument, there's a stone there on the ground with a plaque, and it's in the middle of a trailer park now, that location. That was 1758. Many of the stories at that time, I might mention though, there's a lot of questions about how many of these stories about Putnam are accurate. This is a long time ago, and the people that he served with, as well as the enemy, weren't the kind of people who wrote books, who wrote like diaries. They just weren't. Putnam wasn't. He never wrote anything except like a half-finished journal. But one indication is one of the great heroes of the Revolution, a man called Seth Warner, who with Ethan Allen co-founded the Green Mountain Boys, and who later on was a hero at the Battle of Bennington, which really was one of the most important battles of the Revolution. He named his firstborn son Israel Putnam Warner, a few years after the French and Indian War. He knew him well. So Putnam's reputation there was so great that these stories, they were followed up and they were carried on by word of mouth by a lot of these veterans. War's over. Probably very few people know this, but Spain came in right at the end of the French and Indian War on the side of the French. So Putnam was asked, and his militia, he was asked to lead the Connecticut militia, along with militia from New York and New Jersey, to Cuba, where they were to attack Havana. And they did that. At the end of the French and Indian War, they took the expedition down with a few thousand men, and Putnam was shipwrecked off the coast of Havana. And then he was part of the opposing force, the invading force of the British that took over Havana in the last months of the war. And I've got that, documented in the book.
So I just have a quick question about that. Yeah. How big was the Spanish force in Havana, and how big was the British force going to Havana?
The British, under Putnam were about 500 soldiers. The others, I'm guessing. I think I have the number in the book for the British side. A couple thousand. Okay, it wasn't huge. Actually, the general that was in charge, General Lyman, was from Connecticut, and he was in charge of the Connecticut troops. And then they told him he should be in charge of all the troops. And when they appointed it, Israel Putnam filled in the position to be in charge of just Connecticut, that's just that state's troops. But again, and when they were shipwrecked, there were more, I think it was 2 ships that under Putnam, and they just barely made it to land because it was in the dead of night in a storm. Fortunately, they had like rope on board, lots and lots of rope, and they made rafts, and that's how they get. I also mentioned one other story that occurred down there when he was there, when he freed a slave. A slave was being beaten, and he came to Putnam afterwards and asked if he could be taken back to Connecticut. And he served as Putnam's right-hand man for the rest of Putnam's life, 28 more years. And after Putnam died, or when Putnam died, he gave his cane to the slave, the cane that he had used to hit or to take away from the slave's master in Cuba. And he gave it to the man, and for the rest of that man's life, he always talked about how Putnam saved his life. And he lived in Putnam's hometown of Pomfret.
But as a free person or as an enslaved person?
As a free person. As a free person in Pomfret. And he used to go around town, and he loved to tell that story to people, and he would show them the cane that Putnam had used. Okay, and between the wars, okay, unfortunately, some bad things happened. He came home, and just a short while later, his wife, Hannah, died. She was only 44 years old. Putnam was 45. They had 7 kids. The youngest kid was only 3 months old. So Putnam had to really, fortunately, had a large family, could help him take care of the children when he managed his farm. But 2 years later, he remarried a woman named Deborah Avery Gardner. She was twice widowed already, and her first husband had been the congregational minister of the town, Brooklyn, and her second husband was John Gardner, the owner of Gardner Island off the east coast of the east end of Long Island. Okay, Gardner's Island even today is really famous as being one of the largest islands owned by one family for like centuries, 3 or 4 centuries. And so after he died, she went back to Connecticut and married Israel and lived on the farm. But I think she was a little bit bored by living on a farm in the middle of nowhere, because I think she convinced Israel to move into her first husband's home downtown and make a tavern out of it. And that's what he did. And so he spent those years entertaining a lot of the old veterans of the French and Indian War as they came all the way up to Pomfret to meet their old commanding officer. And he was pretty good at that, because if you know anything about Putnam, he really liked food and drink. And matter of fact, I have a little picture of him here. By the way, what time is it? Okay, 7:44. I'm going to be wrapping up in a moment. I just finished the war. Here's a little picture of Israel somewhere here. The most important picture I have. There it is. Right here. This picture was painted by John Trumbull, who was the most famous portrait painter of Revolutionary War famous people. After he did this, someone remarked that he must have really disliked Putnam when he did it, because it is not one of the most flattering pictures of Putnam. Putnam, though, at least in his later years, was very much overweight. He was only about 5'6" tall, and his hair pretty much looked like this. Here's a picture on the cover of my book where he's much more handsome. And this is taken from a picture that was done in the 1800s, and it was colorized by the publisher. The original is black and white. Okay. I would say the way Putnam looked is somewhere between these two. Okay, he was a little more handsome than that, but maybe not as good looking as this. Any questions? Okay, maybe some comments. Anyone have a comment?
A quick question, Professor.
Yep.
Any truth? I mean, going back through what I've read and everything, the French officers that saved him. Is there any truth to that it was Montcalm himself that actually stepped in?
I've read that. Okay, I've read that, and I've tried to do some research to determine, like, exactly who it was, but I have not been able to come to a conclusion. I don't think it was him himself who was, like, commanding general of the French army. I don't think it was himself, but I wasn't able to get a conclusive answer to that. But that's an excellent question, and if you find out anything more on that, please let me know. All right. I don't expect to produce another revised version of the book, but who knows? Oh, by the way, I got to mention this. I got to put a plug in. When I was writing the book, I ran across a man who was very much close to Putnam at various times in his life, and that was his cousin Rufus. He was actually a partial cousin because they were related. Rufus's grandfather was Putnam's, Rufus's grandfather, and was also Putnam's father, half grandfather was Putnam's father, or something like that. But they were like second cousins. And this is a picture of Rufus in my new book on Rufus Putnam. And Rufus, in the French and Indian War, served for a time under Israel. And then during the American Revolution, he also served under Israel for a time up in the Hudson Highlands. And in between the wars, the two men, along with a few other veterans, took an expedition up the Mississippi River. So at various times in his life, Rufus was very close to him. Also, Rufus was a great person in his own right. After the war was over, he went out and he became what is now called the Father of Ohio. And one of the great things of reading of him is that he, perhaps more than anyone else, is responsible for Ohio being admitted to the Union as a non-slave state. And in addition to that, what he did in Ohio reverberated over the other parts of the new territory that was gathered from Britain at the end of the war, and formed the states of Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and parts of Minnesota, and they also became non-slave states. So Putnam had a great influence on what would happen to those states in the 1800s. By the way, it's the same publisher. Yeah.
I have a question about the campaign to Havana, which seems like in a really bizarre moment in American history. I mean, so if Putnam is basically a sheep farmer and he's, responsible for 500 militia soldiers who are also not professional soldiers or professional naval soldiers, like, what was the plan? Like, they were just going to sail over there and get off the boat and attack Havana?
Exactly. Okay. The Spanish were the enemies then. Okay. Even though they were recent enemies, they were on the side of the French, and they also controlled a lot of land. Spain controlled a lot of land on the mainland. So it was important for them to do something to stop them from expanding. I'm not sure how. I'm not an expert in that phase of the war, but to stop them, and the best way to do it is to attack their major city, which is Havana, just like it is today. And they were successful, and it didn't take long. I forget how long. It's in my book, but they were successful, and by that time the war was virtually over. So yeah, there wasn't. If they didn't go down, it probably wouldn't have meant much as far as the outcome for the American colonies and for the French. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, and also there isn't any documentation on Putnam's role in the actual fighting to capture Havana. Okay, it's known that he was there and participated, but there's actually no detail in that regard. One thing that is mentioned is he he put out an order, which is still in existence, to his troops saying to respect the local population. All right. And because the local Putnam came from an area where, came from Puritans, the Protestant of New England, but the people down there were primarily Catholic. And there was a lot of conflict between his soldiers and the people. And he put out an order, very strict, leave the people alone and respect them. And that's the way he was through his whole life. As a matter of fact, I can't remember anything where Putnam was showing any sort of religious bigotry or racial prejudice except toward Quakers, which was not surprising because Putnam was a military man, and like a lot of them, they resented the fact that Quakers were pacifists. And that's not just that war, but many wars were like that. So that was his one bias, I think. It was also interesting because someone mentioned before Nathaniel Greene, and General Nathaniel Greene came from a Quaker family. And he was almost disowned by a lot of his family because he became a fighter, a general in the Revolution. But he was from Rhode Island. And there were others like that too.
So do we know if Putnam met George Washington like during the French and Indian War at all, or did he meet any of those other major players, the 75 important generals you were talking about during the French and Indian War, or is it just his reputation?
Well, George Washington's primarily field of service was often like Western Virginia, and that's what he was known for. I'm not that knowledgeable of where Washington served throughout the whole French and Indian War, but Putnam was pretty much based during the war just in Upper New York State. So Washington would have had a different area of service than Putnam did, right? Also in the Revolution, obviously, he knew him well in the Revolution. He really got to know Washington for the first time at about the time of Bunker Hill, where he and his second wife, Deborah, went up and they would dine with the Washingtons like almost every night for a couple of weeks. And one night they would be at the Washington's residence, and then the next night they would be at the Putnam residence. So they got to know each other very, very well at that time. Now you have to remember, Putnam was 14 years older than Washington. Mm-hmm. So when Washington was growing up, Putnam may have been one of his heroes because he was like a legend in his own time after the French and Indian War. And even though Washington was in Virginia, he still would have known what was happening in the other colonies. So he heard about Putnam, but not much more than that. And then during the war, obviously, Putnam reported directly to Washington throughout the entire time he served in the Revolution, which was 3.5 years, because he was a major general. So who is he going to report to? He has to report to Washington because there aren't that many major generals, and they're all, at least on his level. At one time in the Revolution, he was the oldest. I mentioned there were 75 generals in the Revolution. He was the oldest one at one time, the oldest one, because he was well into his he was over 60 at that time. They got along very well, but as I will talk about next month, there was a real problem when Putnam apparently did not follow one of Washington's instructions that was delivered by Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton and Putnam did not get along. And a piece of trivia, I'll throw it out in advance, one of Putnam's aides, in addition to being, David Humphreys, the writer, as an aide, he also had another man as an aide, and that was the man who killed Alexander Hamilton. And anyone know his name?
Burr.
Yeah, Aaron Burr. So for a time, when Putnam was serving, was in control of the troops in the southern end of Manhattan, his main aide was Aaron Burr. Now, obviously, that's a couple decades before he became vice president of the United States, and even longer before he became apparently a traitor.
Professor, any possibility that the animosity between Burr and Hamilton actually dated back to that time during the war? When
I thought of that, And I looked into it. And unfortunately, I couldn't find any evidence that there was a relationship. I think probably that one of the reasons that Hamilton and Putnam didn't get along is because Hamilton was passing along orders from Washington, and he was a very arrogant young man because he was brilliant and he was really, really confident in himself. He probably just passed them along as if they were his own orders, and Putnam resented it because Putnam was 3 times the age of Hamilton. So I think there was a little generational conflict there too. But I did not, to answer you, I did not find anything along those lines that I could point that out. Yes. Okay. Is someone talking?
Well, you were on mute if you were trying to say something.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I was talking to the woman here.
Oh.
She's listening too.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
So I know that one of the things that we were interested in general is that, you know, there are so many Putnam things, you know, in Portchester. There's Putnam Drive, there's Putnam Avenue, there's the Putnam Fire Engine and Hose. I might not have that title quite correctly. Fire Company. And then, of course, there is a plaque on the front of the homestead which says that it was General Putnam's headquarters. But we don't have anything actually that shows that it was his headquarters.
Plus we have teacups and glasses.
Yes. Right,
Yeah.
which someone has said were his glasses, which seems rather unlikely to me, but that's just me.
Yeah, they could be. You know, you have to remember that after the war, he was a really a well-known person in New England because of his exploits during the French and Indian War. And so people might have saved things. And then after the Revolution, definitely, if there's anything that dates from those years, there's an excellent chance they are authentic because he was like Churchill was in the 1950s. I mean, he was the hero of the country, or one of the heroes of the country. You know, sometimes, like I said, second only to George Washington in his heroic status. He was like I said, Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett would be decades later, and like they were when, you know, Walt Disney put out his shows on the 2 characters. That's what Israel Putnam was like in the mid 1700s.
Yes, he seems a little bit like a folk hero.
Yes,
What you've told us so far.
that's absolutely right. And let's see if I have something here. Oh, here's a couple more pictures I want to show you that I had brought. One, this is his house. This is the home that was his from probably the time he was in his late 20s when he built it until his death. He died in this home, this house. It still exists up in Pomfret, Connecticut. And it's now a private residence, so you can't really visit it, but you can see it. His house wasn't really, it's a colonial, but it really wasn't this big. Half the house was his. That was built when he was a young man. The other half is the house of Israel Putnam Jr., who was that 1-year-old that moved to Massachusetts with his parents. And they put the 2 houses together and made it into one building. So that's why it's so large. Also, his birthplace is up in Danvers, Massachusetts. It's still in existence as well. And unfortunately, you can't go into that because it's under renovation right now. Okay, but both buildings are still around. And this is a picture someone gave me of the wolf den story, where Putnam is pulling the wolf out of the den, and the other like farmers are gathered around him.
And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a mural. Paul, I know you can speak about that. There's a mural in Greenwich Library, which I think is supposed to be Israel Putnam.
I've heard of it. I've heard of it. I read an article on that and seen a picture of it. You know, next time I'm down there, I'm going to take a look. I did a talk 3 years ago for the Historical Society of Greenwich, and I did at the Putnam Cottage. And that's another place people could visit. It's right on Route 1, and it's a red building, a red colonial, and there's a story about Putnam when he was very elderly and he was still a major general, and something that happened right there when he escaped from the British. And I'm going to be covering that next time. But hey, if someone there has a chance to visit that and within the next month, you know, I'd be interested in getting their take on it. I don't think you probably want to go in it during the time of the virus, but you don't have to go in it to really enjoy the surroundings. And when I went there, they had a reenactment. They had someone playing Putnam on a horse and a bunch of Revolutionary soldiers, and they had a little, you know, with muskets, and had a reenactment. And then I gave my talk inside the cottage. It's also called the Nap Tavern. Yeah, it's a good place to visit. And here's a couple more places to visit. I was digging through my files. This is the Putnam History Museum. I gave a talk here about 1.5 years ago, right up the river. It's right next to Garrison, New York, where Putnam's second wife, Deborah, is buried. And Putnam Memorial Park, which is south of Danbury, Connecticut, not that far from Route 84. And actually, from Portchester, the fastest way to get there is just go up the Parkway and then hit Route 7 and go north. And this is a great thing. And there's a statue, another equestrian statue. Here's Putnam on his horse. And this is the museum, but most of it's outdoors. So even if you don't want to go inside a building during this time of COVID, you might want to just plan a picnic across the road where they have a little state park, and then, you know, visit the grounds where Putnam's troops camped during the Revolution. And I might mention, right after this, another year later, was the end of Putnam's career. Okay, he went through the whole Revolution throughout the 3.5 years that the battles took place in the northern states. And then when things shifted to the south of like Maryland, he was incapacitated. And I'll speak about that, you know, in the future. But that was the end of his career. So he lasted through, as a general, all of the Revolutionary War years that where the fighting took place in the north.
What was the alternate name for the Putnam Cottage? Did you say Nap Tavern?
Nap, K-N-A-P-P, Nap Tavern.
Ah, so that name Nap appears in the city of Rye. There's a Nap.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was the name of the I guess original owner of the tavern there, and they had nicknamed it Putnam Cottage for, you know, many years, and I think maybe now they went back to the name Nap Tavern.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Professor, going back to the Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, you know, when the truth and the legend conflict, print the legend, so to speak.
Right.
About
which comes from the movie Tombstone, I think.
Yeah, I actually think it wasn't it Tombstone or Liberty Balance. I'm not sure, but the whole story about him in the tobacco industry in Connecticut, is that a pot roll or is that actual truth? That
I think it's true. I think it's true. From what I've read, the story is he took 3 donkey loads of tobacco and tobacco seeds out of Cuba and came back here with them. Now, he was commanding officer of the Connecticut militia, so he would certainly be in a position to do that. If he was just a private, like he was in the beginning of the French and Indian War, no, he wouldn't be able to do. But as commanding officer, he would be able to transport it back. And he did, a few years later, start up the tavern. So he definitely sold cigars at his tavern. And it's said, now I'm not sure if this is all totally true, it's said that he started the tobacco industry in Connecticut, which, if anyone knows about north of Hartford, Connecticut, they have the tobacco fields that grow primarily tobacco wrappers for cigars. So it was like the best cigars were the Cuban cigars, and those were often, back in the 20th century, wrapped in the tobacco leaves from Connecticut because of their nature. So they became famous, and said that Putnam was the origin, or he originated that. He also, by the way, was, it's believed he was also the founder of the first beer brewery in Eastern Connecticut. So he, it goes right along with his role as a tavern keeper. And if you knew his personality, one of the things he was really known for was his sense of humor. And I didn't touch on that today because it's, French and Indian War isn't too funny. But he was like, his personality fit the role of tavern keeper. He was that kind of guy.
Interesting.
Well, does anybody have any more questions or comments for Professor Hubbard? I know we've taken up a good hour of his time on just this. Does anybody have anything to say?
Yes, just one thought. Of course, we're interested in his connection to Portchester and the Bush Lion homestead. So anything that the professor could tell us would be gratefully received.
Okay, Kiki and I spoke about this about 6 months ago on the phone. I don't have in my files any documents that mention that particular building. But as I told her, Putnam had so many places that he was headquartered throughout New York and New York State that it wouldn't be surprising at all if that was one of the places for a short time he called his headquarters. If you go on Wikipedia and you look up George Washington's headquarters, they list over 200.
Yes, I know.
And that's because every time he stayed in a different building, even for one night, it was called his headquarters.
Right.
So actually, it would surprise me if Putnam didn't stay in your building right there for at least a night, right? Because there weren't that many buildings of that size around at that time, and that was right in his path.
Well, so now actually that brings up an important point, is that we should probably try and put together, we just had a historic structures report done on the homestead. So we should try and figure out there was an original building and then it was much added to over time. But to try and figure out what the building would have been like exactly in the Revolutionary, because it did start out rather small. So right. Then maybe it would have been, okay. But so we will look into that, and maybe we'll have something to tell you by the time we have a month from now.
I think the answer to this question lies, if it's around at all, it lies in the original documents that are found in your archives of the Historical Society, the libraries down there, historical collections. Somewhere in there might be diaries or legal documents that touch upon this. I don't think I don't think you'll find some work that's been published and distributed widely in the past that really covers this.
Kiki,
yeah.
And part of the research we've been doing, for the history of the fire department, obviously we've been looking into General Putnam because one of the companies is named after him, but did find a letter from him to Washington specifically mentioning saw pits.
Oh, excellent.
So, and purchase, both.
Yeah.
So.
One of the, and just so you know, Professor Hubbard, one of the challenges is that the Bushes and the Lions had lots of houses around here. So since they were both, landed families with lots of different, so one of the things that is a difficulty about trying to figure out, exactly which house you would be talking about, is that they just had a whole bunch of them. If you're saying like, you know, unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of people named John Lyon too. So, and a lot of, you know, like they all just cycled through the same names over and over and over again.
Right, right.
Okay, but Mike, that sounds awesome. Maybe that's something that, you know, if you send it to me, I'll send it up to Professor Hubbard, and then, you know, we can figure that out a little bit more.
Absolutely. I will say this: the Kent had atrocious spelling.
Well, I don't think spelling was really standardized.
No, it was. Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
we can
if you,
cut him some slack.
if you notice, if you see anything by Israel Putnam and it's signed and you want to know if he wrote it personally, look for spelling errors, because if it doesn't have a heck of a lot of spelling errors, he did not write it. He may have signed it, but one of his aides probably wrote it.
This one definitely is quite, you know, interesting spelling. So it's got to be definitely from him.
Excellent. So does anybody have anything else they'd like to bring up, or? No? Okay, well then I'm going to say thank you very much from the Portchester Historical Society to Professor Hubbard. We look forward very much to the next lecture, which I believe is on October 22nd. Anybody want to check me on that before I record something? I hope that's it. And this will be the same thing. Oh, someone is October 28th. Thank you, Miriam. Okay, October 28th. So hopefully we'll say that.
Can I give everyone some homework?
Yes, please do.
Okay, yes. If you would like to purchase the Israel Putnam book, it's on sale at Amazon and all kinds of places. But you can also, for much less money, you can purchase the Kindle edition if you like reading ebooks. And if you really want to spend less and you want to get it for free, if you go on Amazon, they'll show you the first 40 or so pages of the book, which you can read. So you can get a little caught up a little bit on maybe give me some more really good questions like you have tonight.
I feel like we should spring for at least one copy for the Historical Society to own, and then that we could then donate to the local library, because I don't think the local library has it. And if this is part of our local history, it should be in our local history section. So that's what I would say.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, you know, and so I'm going to say good night to everybody, and thank you for your good questions and your good attention, and hopefully we'll have even more questions for the professor in the next.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.